The final Twofer Thursday of the Big Ten basketball regular season, and we are discussing two teams in action tonight, two of the top 5 teams in the country. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Locked On Big Ten podcast, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Ben Stevens. It is Twofer Thursday, March 4th, and on this Twofer Thursday, we talk about the number 2 team in the land, the Michigan Wolverines, and the number 5 team in the country, the Iowa Hawkeyes, both teams in action in a doubleheader of Big Ten basketball on this Thursday evening. And we start with the second-ranked Michigan Wolverines suffering a tough loss on Tuesday night, and we'll dive into that recap and look forward to what Michigan has remaining in the regular season. And doing that with us today is Daniel Dash. He is a men's basketball beat writer for Maize and Brew of SB Nation, covering everything about Michigan athletics and specifically Michigan basketball during what has still been a great season in Ann Arbor. Daniel, pleasure to have you back on the podcast.
Appreciate you having me back on. This is always a blast.
So, Daniel, I expected when we were talking the other day to have you on and to be celebrating Michigan's clinch of the number 1 seed heading into the Big Ten tournament, especially when we got the news on Tuesday evening that Ayo Dosunmu would be out for the game for Illinois against Michigan. It obviously did not go that way. What went wrong for Michigan on Tuesday night in the game against the Illini?
I think the two biggest stats that stood out to me were rebounding and ball movement. Michigan was out-rebounded 42-26. I mean, putting yourself in a minus 16 hole on the glass is it's tough to win a Big Ten basketball game when you set yourself back in a way like that. And then at the other end of the floor, on offense, this is a Michigan offense that's really built on ball movement. And yesterday, from now when this is airing, I suppose 2 days ago, when the Illinois defense came out in a very, very intense drop coverage defense, something Michigan hasn't seen all year. It's built around Kofi Cockburn and really, really emphasizes limiting ball movement, limiting assisted baskets, and limiting three-point attempts. Michigan, you really saw the results. This is a team that really averages close to 14, 15 assists a game, and they finished with a season worst 4. Mike Smith, graduate transfer point guard, leads the Big Ten in assists, finished with 0. And then you look at, Michigan is a team that shoots the 3-ball and shoots the 3-ball well. They do it at a high volume, at a high clip. They took 7 threes the entire game. Just never really found a rhythm, never really got the ball rolling in the game. They were kind of trading buckets until the, I'd say, 10 to 12 minute mark in the first half, and that's when Illinois really, really pulled away. Dickinson picked up a second foul late in the first half, and there was no turning back from there.
And that's why we bring Daniel Dash onto the Locked On Big Ten podcast on this important Twofer Thursday, because the insight he just provided about Illinois' drop coverage defense they ran against the Wolverines on Tuesday night is so very sound, because it's something that Michigan hadn't really seen up to this point of the year, and a great way for Brad Underwood to defend that Michigan attack. Illinois wasn't really leaving shooters. There wasn't a whole lot of open passing lanes to take advantage of, and we saw Michigan struggle offensively against the Illini. Do you think they can learn from that, though, moving forward to understand this might be a way that some of the best teams in college basketball try to defend that Michigan offense?
I agree. I think that, this is a very, very reminiscent of mid-January when Michigan went to Minneapolis without Eli Brooks and got run out of the barn. And then after that, we actually got to talk to Phil Martelli, Michigan's associate head coach, been coaching college basketball for 4 decades. He's been there, been on the wrong side of more than a few blowout losses. And his biggest concern wasn't about the game, it was about the big picture. And he thought that loss and Michigan's putrid offensive performance and the way Minnesota went out and defended them would leave what he called a roadmap for the rest of the Big Ten to follow. Michigan, shortly after, went on a COVID pause, which I guess took way more of a priority than trying to prevent a roadmap. But I think that you might see a lot more drop coverage against Michigan now. Illinois, personnel-wise, is in a really good position to go at a team with drop coverage because they have Kofi Cockburn on the back end, 7 foot, 285-pound, absolute mountain of a man. Helps to have him back there anchoring everything. But you could see a lot of teams trying to jump passing lanes, maybe sagging off some more ball screens and really trying to make Michigan uncomfortable. So I do think that this is a legitimate concern for Michigan.
So Phil Martelli said after the Minnesota loss, the first loss of Michigan's year, he was concerned big picture. Now I asked Daniel Dash, after the Illinois loss, Michigan's second loss of this season, are you concerned big picture as we are now in the month of March for Michigan?
I think immediately after the game, there were sort of dark thoughts about how that could be replicated, because Illinois, even without Ayo Dosunmu, made it look so effortless. They really just waltzed into Chrysler and ran Michigan off their own court. But the way I see it, and after sleeping on it, I think that Michigan's ceiling remains the same. I still think this is a team that's firmly in the national title conversation, a team that should be able to lock up a Big Ten outright regular season title tonight with a win over Michigan State. But when you look at Michigan's floor now, I think before the Illinois game, you can make the argument that Michigan had the highest floor in the country. Now you have to question that. You have to question that. If a team can come out on a night when they have the opportunity to win an outright conference title on their own floor, on a senior-led team with an unbelievable amount of experience, and they come out so flat and so, I mean, I wouldn't say they were going through the motions, but if you look at the two benches side by side, Illinois was hooting and hollering, and Michigan, who really calls themselves the bench mob for bringing in the energy off the bench and kind of a dead arena, they brought nothing. And I think that so much of their floor is rooted in intangibles. And when I say intangibles, I'm specifically talking about defense and energy. And I think that both of those were lacking in a big way on Tuesday. And hey, if that's something that happens on a neutral court game in the round of 32 when there's a dead environment and an 11 a.m. tip, that's a real concern. There's no kind of getting around that. And I think last night Michigan tried to get around that. Isaiah Livers tried to shoot them back into the game. Hunter Dickinson tried to go at Kofi Coburn and get them back in the game. Franz Wagner tried to create on his own and get them back in the game. And the result was the three of them, Michigan's three leading scorers, finished a combined 4 for 24 from the field. So if that's Michigan's floor and they get picked off on maybe the wrong day, at the wrong time, at the wrong place, I think an early exit does become a legitimate concern.
The reason I felt so comfortable in the last 2 weeks of making the argument that Michigan was on the same exact tier as Gonzaga and Baylor and being the best team out of the Big Ten Conference, college basketball's best conference throughout this entire season, was because of the consistency we had seen with Michigan, unlike teams like Iowa or even Illinois, who at their best, yes, are up there with the best in college basketball. But Michigan's consistency, I thought, would win the day. I think you bring up a great point that there might be a few more holes you could poke in that argument as of right now. But a quick turnaround for Michigan tonight, hosting Michigan State inside the Chrysler Center. How do the Wolverines turn it around so quickly to face the rivals, the Spartans, this evening?
You got to get back to team basketball. You got to get back to ball movement. I think that's kind of chief priority number one. Michigan's a really unique team in the sense that college basketball is a sport that's become so individualized over the last, I'd say, decade or so. And you see that this year on the national stage. I think Illinois and Iowa, even within the Big Ten, they lean heavily on their top guys. And that's the reason why Luka Garza and I just assume are player of the year candidates. But it's also one of the reasons I thought Michigan was able to separate itself from the rest of the Big Ten. They play team basketball. They have 6 guys who average at least 8 points per game. It can be any one of them who gets you on any given night. I think they've had 5 or 6 different Ken Pom game MVPs throughout this year. I mean, this is really a team where they're going to take what the defense gives you, and they've gotten so good at finding what to take that I think that their floor, in my eyes, was higher than a lot of those teams that really rely on one guy. Because I think you see when Iowa came to Chrysler and Luka Garza shot 6 for 19, Iowa never had a chance. They were run off the court. You look at Illinois when they went to East Lansing, playing a struggling Michigan State team, and I would assume can't find water if he was falling out of a boat. They get kind of run off the floor at Breslin. So I think Michigan, to get back to that upper echelon of college basketball, not that they fell out of it with a loss to Illinois, but to really, really reestablish themselves and show that Tuesday was a fluke, they need to get back to team basketball and kind of the ball movement that allowed them to make such a meteoric rise in the first place.
So Daniel Dash, a men's basketball beat writer for SB Nation's Maize and Brew, giving us great insight on this first part of our Twofer Thursday. Michigan in action tonight, Iowa in action. We will talk with a Hawkeyes perspective coming up in just a bit, but let's dive into the game tonight against Michigan State. The first part of a back-to-back against the Spartans to end out the season, with all the storylines now surrounding this game, with Michigan State being on the right side of the bubble currently, and Michigan trying to reestablish themselves among that upper echelon in college basketball, also given the rivalry between these two basketball programs. What do you expect out of tonight's first game against the Spartans?
I think Michigan's got to go to Hunter Dickinson. Big men have killed the Spartans all year, whether it's Garza, Trace Jackson Davis, Kofi Coburn. I think Michigan State's really, really shown a weakness of struggling big men. And because of that, I don't know, it seems like Tom Izzo's strategy is just to throw bodies at guys. I mean, they'll throw in Thomas Kithier has done a good job recently, but Julius Marble, Malik Hall, I mean, those are guys who have just been bullied in the low post throughout the Big Ten season. So if Hunter Dickinson, after a 1-for-8 shooting night and I believe his lowest point total since coming off the COVID pause with just 6 points on Tuesday, can find his rhythm, I think that opens up a lot for Michigan. If Michigan State can start double teaming him, Dickinson being the elite passer that he is out of the post, can really kind of get the gears turning again on that offense, help them fall back into a rhythm. But I think to start, instead of trying to maybe shoot your way into the game, you see if you can get some quick points down low with Dickinson, get him back into a rhythm.
Tonight, Ken Palm predicts Michigan to win by a total of 15 points. What do you expect the outcome to be?
It's going to be closer than that.
Okay.
In this rivalry, nobody runs the other team off the court. This really wasn't much of a rivalry for the early 2000s, but over the last decade or so, when John Beilein really turned around the Michigan program, this has become arguably the healthiest rivalry in college basketball. Michigan State, obviously, being in a little bit of a weird Big Ten season for them. I mean, you rarely see the Spartans below 500. They're not going to roll over. That's the thing. They've shown that throughout the year that they're going to be in games. I think the only real blowout where it looked like they maybe threw it in the towel was at Breslin against Iowa. I don't think that's going to be the case in a game like this. So many players from both rosters come from the state of Michigan. You know, that gives them an extra edge going into a game like this. I'd be shocked if Michigan won this game by double digits, but I do expect them to clinch an outright Big Ten title tonight.
A great rivalry game this evening. Michigan State visits the Chrysler Center in second-ranked Michigan, 7 p.m. Eastern tip on ESPN. A chance for those Michigan Wolverines, like Daniel Dash just mentioned, to clinch the number 1 overall seed for the Big Ten tournament. So much at stake. They play each other to end out the regular season in a back-to-back, and as it stands right now, Michigan State, the 9 seed in the Big Ten tournament, they would face Rutgers if it ended today. It could set up a third game against Michigan in about an 8-day span. So much on the horizon and so much great information from Daniel Dash, a men's basketball beat writer for SB Nation's Maize and Brew, giving it to you on the final Twofer Thursday of the Big Ten basketball regular season. Daniel, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me on.
In the second game of this Twofer Thursday night in the Big Ten Conference features the 5th-ranked team in the country, the Iowa Hawkeyes, hosting the Nebraska Cornhuskers, a rivalry game in its essence as well. So here to preview the game and give us the perspective of the Hawkeyes heading into this home stretch of Big Ten play is Jarek Andrzejewski. He is a basketball reporter for Hawkeye Headquarters. He's been on the show before. He is back to provide the insight only he can covering those Iowa Hawkeyes. Jarek, pleasure to have you back on the podcast.
Thanks for having me back, man.
So let's dive into Iowa's stretch run. But before we get to the final 2 games of the regular season, let's look back to Sunday, because in my mind, the impressive victory over Ohio State was the best win for Iowa so far this season in terms of an overall performance. And I highlight the defense, which has drastically improved over the past month or so. It is all the way up to 58th in the Ken Palm defensive efficiency ranking. So Jarek, I ask you, how did that happen for Fran McCaffrey and company?
Well, the biggest change was they stopped playing zone. They really fell out of playing zone and started playing more man-to-man defense. And that seems to be a system and a scheme that the Hawkeyes are just more comfortable playing. With the zone, that's when we saw all these teams sort of go on 3-point barrages against the Hawkeyes. That zone just was a little late shifting over sometimes. And with man, that hasn't really been as big of an issue. So their defense has stepped up, and that's really been the biggest key during this last month, like you said, for the Hawkeyes sort of going on this winning streak after dropping 4 straight in the middle of the Big Ten season. They got out of the zone. They started playing more man defense, and the results have been speaking for themselves.
And now Iowa has won 4 of their last 5 games. The only loss in that time to Michigan a couple of weeks ago. Actually, it might be 5 of their last 6 now that I'm thinking about it. It is 5 of their last 6.
5 of their last 6, yep.
Yes, there you go. Sometimes you got to keep up with the schedule a little bit better there, Big Ten Ben. But anyway, Jarek, so Iowa still has a path to the number 1 overall seed, as we were talking with our resident bracketologist on yesterday's Bracketology Wednesday episode, but that path is a little bit harder now given Illinois' dominant win over Michigan on Tuesday. Do you still think the Hawkeyes have a chance of claiming a 1 seed in the national tournament?
Yeah, I think they do. I think when you look at sort of the big players in the Big Ten between Iowa, Illinois, Michigan, and Ohio State, I think if any of those teams win out and win the Big Ten tournament, they're in contention for a number 1 seed. I think it's possible we see 2 Big Ten teams get a number 1 seed in this tournament. So if Iowa can take care of business against Nebraska and Wisconsin, and they find themselves at the end of the Big Ten tournament as champions, I think that that's sort of their path right now. I don't see any other scenario where it happens, so it's not going to be easy, but it's certainly still in the cards.
So you think it's get to the Big Ten title game, even win the conference tournament to be a 1 seed in the NCAA tournament?
I think you got to win it. Yeah, I think you got to win the whole Big Ten tournament at this point if you're Iowa. Having losses to Michigan, Illinois, and Ohio State, they did beat Ohio State the second time they played them. But having lost to sort of the three contenders in the Big Ten conference, they sort of have to maybe go a little bit above and beyond than those three do just because of how they fared up against them so far.
So a win in the Big Ten tournament would certainly give Iowa, in my opinion, the 1 seed. It's going to be hard for the selection committee, in my mind, to deny the champion of the best conference in all of college basketball this season a spot on that one line in the NCAA tournament. But speaking of that Big Ten tournament, positioning for the conference tournament still very much in play for the Iowa Hawkeyes. They are tied right now with Purdue in terms of record in the Big Ten conference at 12-6 overall. But Jarek, how confident are you that Iowa remains in that 3 spot before we head to Indianapolis next week?
I'm pretty confident about it. I think that the Nebraska game, maybe earlier in the season, would have concerned me a little bit more. There was a point in time where they seemed to just have mental lapses and sort of overlooked some of the bottom teams. And I feel like that sort of mentality, they've learned from it and they've moved on from it. I think they'll take care of business against Nebraska on Thursday. And then I think they match up really well against Wisconsin on Sunday. That was prior to the Ohio State game. I think their win against Wisconsin was their best win of the season. I think they match up really well against both teams. So I think that the power's sort of in their hands at this point, and I don't see them dropping either of these final 2.
Jarek Andrzejewski, a basketball reporter for Hawkeye HQ, covering the Iowa Hawkeyes with the best of them all across the country and in the state of Iowa as well. Jarek, I asked you a question about this Nebraska game tonight. It is somewhat of a rivalry in football for sure. Do you think it is a rivalry on the hardwood?
No. I actually my stepdad went to Nebraska, so we have a bit of a back and forth here whenever Iowa and Nebraska play each other, and he doesn't want to talk about basketball. He always wants to talk about football. When the basketball game comes up, he's not as interested as talking Cornhuskers at that point. I don't think it's as big of a rivalry. I don't think either team really sees it like a big rivalry outside the fact that they're both in the Big Ten, and all those games are going to have an extra level of motivation in them.
There was a time 3 years ago when I was working in Omaha, Nebraska, when both teams started off Big Ten play a perfect 3-0, and Nebraska was receiving votes in the AP poll, and that game had a little bit of rivalry to it. I remember doing some promo spots for our news coverage that night. It has not really gone that way, but back in 2019, the 2019-2020 season, Nebraska's last win before this season of Big Ten basketball came against the Iowa Hawkeyes in early January. Things are very different now in March of 2021. So let's preview that Nebraska game tonight. What do you expect from both sides, and what do you think the result will be on this Twofer Thursday?
I mean, I think one thing notably is obviously for Iowa still sort of figuring out the loss of Jack Nunge for the rest of the season. He was really their only extra size coming in after Luke Garza. So figuring out how Fran McCaffrey wants to use his minutes and use his rotation. We saw against Ohio State, they just played 8 men. They had Patrick McCaffrey, Keegan Murray, and Joe Toussaint come off the bench, and that was all they did. It'll be interesting to see if they go with that again against Nebraska. This would normally be a game where Iowa has a pretty big size advantage against them, and they still do. But missing Jack Nunge out sort of limits how much you can just feed the ball down low if Luke is not in the game. Now, he played 38 minutes against Ohio State, so I don't know how much rest he's going to be getting against Nebraska either. But I think that how they still figure out how they want to run their rotation and their schemes without Jack Nunge is important in this game. And I think just keeping up the hot shooting for Iowa. Joe Wieskamp has been on fire, one of the best shooters in college basketball. CJ Frederick, after some injury problems, he's sort of come back into his own. He's looking for a shot again. He sort of played a little passive his first couple of games back from that injury. He's looking like his normal self again. He was one of the best shooters in the Big Ten Conference this year and last. And Bohannon sort of started to find his stroke after a streaky start to the season. So I think looking for Iowa, how they end up using their rotation and their bench players and then just keeping the hot shooting going will be the biggest keys for them.
Tonight is Iowa's first game since that impressive victory over Ohio State on Sunday. Nebraska coming off a very dominant performance of their own on Monday night, beating Rutgers in the vault in PBA in Lincoln by 21 points. A good win for the Nebraska Cornhuskers, who are on a 2-game winning streak for the first time since March of 2019. So kudos to Fred Hoiberg and company, keeping it going here down the home stretch. The final game for Wisconsin, or for Iowa this year, is Wisconsin this upcoming weekend at home in Carver Hawkeye. Wisconsin has lost 4 of 5. Iowa seems to be finding their form as we get into March. What do you think about that game coming up this weekend to end out the regular season?
I think that that's going to be a tough game. I said earlier that they match up well. Iowa matches up well against Wisconsin, but that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Anytime you beat a team on their own court, they're going to come back to yours with a little extra chip on their shoulder. Wisconsin's not going to go out without a fight. They're going to want to prove themselves and get a win on the road. So that's going to be, I think, that's the bigger question mark for me looking at Iowa's final 2 games is that game against Wisconsin. They're going to be hungry. They're going to want to come out and sort of prove themselves after a disappointing performance against Iowa that sort of snowballed this spiral for them in the final stretch of the season. So that's going to be a tough one. But I think for Iowa, as long as they can limit any offensive rebounds from Wisconsin, that was something they struggled with against them last time, and they can keep up this man-to-man defense that's been working well, I think they're going to put themselves in a pretty good position. And
like Jarek Andrzejewski said earlier on, if Iowa wins these final 2 games of the regular season, they will be the number 3 seed in the Big Ten tournament next week in Indianapolis. So, Jarek, let's take this big picture here. If Iowa plays this level of defense that we have seen over the past 2-3 weeks or so for Fran McCaffrey and company, how deep of a run do you think the Hawkeyes can make in March in the national tournament?
I think that they have a really good chance of getting pretty deep into this tournament. I mean, they've had the best offense in college basketball pretty much from start to finish so far this season. And now that their defense is coming along, and most recently I feel like I'm looking at their defense and I'm like, okay, now they're playing average defense, which is really all you need when you have the best offense. But now I'm starting to look at their defense and I'm like, this is actually good defense that they're playing. Holding Ohio State to under 60 is not an easy thing to do at all, let alone in Columbus. So their defense isn't just average at this point. They're actually starting to find an identity on that side of the floor, and it's paying off for them. So I think if they can keep that man-to-man defense locked in as it has been, their offense isn't really a question mark for me. It's just how that defense is going to play. And if they keep that rolling, I think they're a threat to anybody come March.
I agree with you. If the Hawkeyes are limiting teams to under 70, 75 points a game, even the best teams in college basketball, Iowa can compete with anybody throughout the country. Now, Jarek, tell me, you've been all over the Midwest portion of this country covering Iowa Hawkeye games in person. Are you going to be doing that as we get into the postseason as well?
If the Big Ten lets me, that's the big question. Media credentials a little bit more stingy this time around just because of everything going on. I will be at the women's tournament for sure. I'm hoping I'll be at the men's one as well. But yeah, I would love nothing more than spend a month in Indy or so. That sounds good to me, just soaking in as much Big Ten basketball as I can.
And as we focus on Indianapolis, with the women's tournament being there as well, look out for Caitlin Clark. If you don't know her name already, the very talented freshman for the Iowa Hawkeyes is lighting up the Big Ten Conference, lighting up the country. You've heard of Paige Beckers, I'm sure. Make sure you know the name Caitlin Clark for the Iowa Hawkeyes as well. Jarek Andrzejewski providing us great insight and coverage about Iowa men's basketball, Iowa women's basketball, all throughout this critical run through the rest of the regular season into the postseason as well. Jarek, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben.